So let me introduce our speaker today, Butch Lombardi. We're very fortunate to have Butch with us today to share his beautiful photos and to celebrate the return of to the Osprey and spring. You know, Butch has certainly flourished in his second career as a photographer, and I'm sure most of you have a copy of his calendar hanging up in your home someplace. In addition to his work as a photographer, he's also the chairman of the Warren Conservation Commission, sort of a sister organization looking to conserve space in Warren. And he also volunteers his time to build and repair the Osprey platforms, and he monitors a number of the Osprey nests in Warren and Barrington. And if you want to know about ospreys, you need to talk to Butch. So I'm very glad to be able to let you do that right now. So Butch, take it away.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks for coming too. This is really my first presentation with ospreys. That I worked with the birds and started photographing. I took my first osprey picture in 1972. So it's 50 years ago. And I followed the nest on the Palmer River because it's close to home. And I also grew up on the Palmer River. And the Palmer River is probably one of the most densely populated osprey habitats in the East Bay. In Bristol County as a county, I did a count in my head briefly of the osprey nests going from Bristol, Barrington, and Warren. And I came up with over 70. And that's the ones I can remember. And I'm sure there are more, because there are some we don't know about. And when I was a kid, I grew up on the Palmer River. And I was out, the Palmer River was in our backyard, and it was part of our playground. It was kind of a Huck Finn existence. And we spent a lot of time in a boat up the Palmer River, and I cannot remember ever seeing an osprey back then. And that was because the population had bottomed out, and because of DDT, the ospreys and eagles to a lesser extent were affected by DDT leaching into all the waterways, and it affected the ospreys and eagles by getting into the fish, which ospreys eat exclusively, and eagles eat, among other things. And what they found that the ospreys were, they were mating and they were producing eggs, and the females were laying eggs, and so were the female eagles. But the eggshells, it affected the calcium in the eggshells, and the eggshells became brittle. And when the females tried to incubate, the eggs broke. So their reproductive cycles were not producing new broods, and as the older birds died off, there were no new birds to take their place. So they pretty much disappeared from around this whole area. And now they have come back to pretty much where they were, and probably even better than they were before all this took place. So a lot of that has to go with conservation, a lot of conservation efforts, building platforms, and just helping these birds regain their status in our local areas. The reason this area is such a great habitat for ospreys is if you take Newport County, which is Newport, Portsmouth, Middletown, Little Compton, and Tiverton, this area, Warren, Barrington, Bristol, has more nests than they do. And you would think it would probably be the opposite, but ospreys need shallow water to fish. They can only go about 3 feet deep after a fish. So the ocean doesn't do them any good, and the middle of the bay doesn't really do them any good either. They need a shallow river or shallow ponds in order for them. It's a good habitat for them. The program today is a nest that I followed for a season, thanks to a couple of friends who, this is their nest. Sandy, raise your hand. This is Sandy's nest, and Mike. They let the bird use it. This all started in, you can see the date, 4/17/2012. you look at the rock, there's an osprey on it, and there's kind of a nest on it too. Mike called me and he said, Butch, he said, I got a question. He said, will an osprey build a nest on a rock? I said, yeah, probably. I said, you know, is it viable? I mean, can they build on it? He said, well, they're building on it now. So my next question was, how high is the rock? So I said, well, it'll be out of the water at high tide. And Mike said, well, yeah, probably. I said, what about a moon tide or the king tides that are going to come along in a couple of weeks? And Mike said, probably not. So I kayaked over here about 2 weeks later, and there was nothing left. You can see the light area was where Mike calls it bird shit rock. The light area is all the bird poop. But that's also the high tide line. So the king tides just literally lifted the whole nest off and floated it away. So Mike felt bad for him, and he said, I'm going to build them a platform, which he did. And the following year, the birds took to the platform, which surprised me because the platform was very short, and it's under the power lines, and I thought for sure that the birds would try to nest on one of the power line poles. But they didn't. They took the platform, and when Mike and Rich, this is in 2015, so this is 3 years later, and the nest had failed the previous spring, so Mike decided that they built a crappy nest, so he just took it off the platform, which is not a bad thing to do because they tend to get, these nests tend to get really heavy after a period of years, so it doesn't really affect the birds at all to take the nest off because they will build a new nest. And you can see here, this is 4/7/15, and which is only a couple of days later, and they're well on their way to building a new nest. I've had instances where, and one in particular, where a nest on the Palmer River, which is on the Barrington side, on the Barrington Land Trust property, it was really tilting severely. And Audubon and the Barrington Land Trust called me and asked me if I would go out and look at it and see if I could do something to shore it up, because they were afraid it was going to fall over. So I went out and looked at it, but she was already sitting on eggs, and I didn't want to go out there with a screw gun and screws and a hammer and wood and a saw. So I said, maybe we should just let it be. She's already sitting on eggs. Hopefully, get through the breeding season. So Cindy and I took a trip out to the Grand Canyon and Bryce Canyon. So we were gone for about a week and a half. And when I came back, I decided to go out to the Palmer River and check the nest, and the platform was gone. So it had fallen. So I was on the Swansea side of the river, so I jumped in my truck, drove around, went home, got boots, went over to the other side, walked out to where the platform was, and I found the whole nest was just scattered all over the marsh. So I went to Home Depot and bought lumber. I went back home, built a platform, called my buddy Joey DePasquale, who I knew was off the next day, and I said, Joe, can you give me a hand? And he said, sure. So we went out, and about 11 o'clock the next morning, and we put the platform back up. And the whole time we were working out there, we had two birds circling us. As we walked out of the marsh, when we got to the end of the marsh before I had to walk up the path, I turned around and I took one more look back at the platform, and both birds were sitting on the platform. So I went back the next day to see what they had done, and this is pretty much what they had done in one day. They had this all built already. And a couple of days later, they had a new nest built. Unfortunately, it was too late for them to go to breed and produce a brood, but they continued to nest on that platform until it fell a couple of years ago, and we replaced it with a new composite platform, which shouldn't fall within my lifetime anyway, which is this is once they arrive and they start building the nest, they start mating immediately, and they mate. I think I read where they could mate 200 times in the course of their mating season, which is very short, believe me. And a female, they mate for life, but there will be instances where another male, if the male's around and another male tries to come in, there's an aerial battle that goes on. But sometimes another male will be accepted by a female and breed, she will breed with him also. And they, scientists believe that this is a way they keep the gene pool less exclusive, I guess is probably the best word. They continue to build a nest, and he's bringing in what is seaweed now. And once the nest gets to about this size, she needs to make an egg pocket in the nest. That's where she'll lay her eggs, and that's got to be soft and it's got to be warm. So they'll use like seaweed, grass. Unfortunately, one of the nasty things they bring in is plastic bags. You'll see it in some of the pictures here. Every single nest I ever photographed or worked on had a plastic bag in it. But once the town started banning plastic bags, I noticed that the plastic bags disappeared from the osprey nest. And one of the arguments I made to several organizations, including our town council, was the fact I sent them pictures and I said, every osprey nest I worked on and looked at has a plastic bag in it, and the fact that these birds don't shop at Stop and Shop, they're getting these bags, they're pulling them out of the marshes, and that's where the bags were. So the plastic bag ordinance, actually, you can go by the Ospreys because they really have a thing for plastic bags. So if it's a pretty good barometer, they can't find any if they don't have one in the nest. He'll continue to bring sticks to the nest even after they've mated, and this goes on even after the chicks are born. He'll come in with sticks for whatever reason. It's part of the bonding process, but it can get pretty hysterical. And I've seen this happen numerous times where I'll be watching a nest and he'll come in with a stick. And it's pretty unique when you think that they build this whole thing using their beaks. They don't have any hands, they have feet, but they're built for fishing and not for building stuff. And yet they build these intricate nests that withstand hurricanes and all kinds of storms. And so they're pretty unique engineers when you think about it. But at any rate, he bringing a stick, and then she's standing on the nest, and he'll take the stick and he'll walk around, and he'll look at some spots, and then he'll put it in the nest. And he takes off to go get another one. And she walks over and picks up the stick and moves it. He comes back with another stick, and he does the same thing. He walks around and he puts the stick in, he leaves, she goes and gets the stick and moves it. And this has happened in multiple nests, where this wasn't just one pair. It's kind of like a male-female thing, like, no, the couch doesn't belong there. And if you're watching it, it can get pretty comical. This is 418, and they're still working on the nest, and they're still in the building process, and it's all about bonding. When a young male comes back for his first time, the first thing he does is build a nest. That's basically like providing a house for a future mate. And that's one of the things that they go through and how they attract the females. They'll build their own nest, and then they'll spend the summer or the early season trying to attract a female. Sometimes they'll try to steal somebody else's mate, and other times they will find another female fledgling who has just come back. And once they bond over a nest, they bond for life. And they bond tenaciously to a nesting site. I have multiple stories of people calling me with platforms down, and I'll go and look at the platform, and there'll just be the post left standing, and there'll be a bird sitting on it. And they will sit there for weeks, just waiting like something's going to magically appear. They won't give up that spot. They will give up a breeding season before they give up that spot. And if the nest, if it's a platform, for instance, and it doesn't get rebuilt, they will eventually give that up and look for another spot. But it'll take a long time before they give it up. This is pretty much near the end of you can see that the nest is now, let's see, I'll go back to this slide. If you look at that sideboard, you can see where the top of the nest is on the right. And if this is on the 8th, and then if you look on the 14th, it's gotten higher. And you can see they got a plastic bag in it. If you look there on the left, on the top, there's a bag, so they brought one in. This is just the final touches, and this is now the indication that she's laid her eggs. This is the 23rd of April, and this is the first time since they returned that she's sitting. And once she sits, that's an indication at this juncture, she's probably laying her eggs, because this is a little bit early. They lay their eggs at 2-day intervals, and there's a reason for that. So that the chicks all hatch. The first chick will be probably the alpha chick. That he hatches or she hatches first. The second one hatches about 2 days later, and the next one, if there's 3, happens 2 days later. And in a very few instances, but there have been nests with 4. And then that one hatches 2 days later. And that happens with all birds. They do not lay their eggs, one boom, 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 3 in one day. They're staggered. And it's a way to assure propagation of the species, because basically the chick that gets fed is the chick that makes the most noise. The chick that has his face in front of the mother, the mouth that's open gets fed. And the alpha chick is the biggest and the strongest, so he gets fed first. If there's anything left, it's the next chick that gets fed. The runt, who he's the third one, he gets fed, or he may not get fed. And this ensures the fact that at least one chick will survive. It's thinking of it from a human standpoint, it's kind of brutal, but it's the way it is. And there have been instances where in a nest with 3 chicks, the alpha chick's getting fed, the second chick is getting fed sometimes, third chick may not be getting fed. He gets smaller and weaker as time goes by. And there have been instances where the older chicks will kill the alpha chick and throw it out, kill the runt and throw it out of the nest because of the shortage of food. So, Mother Nature is not pretty in the way she, does things, but it assures that at least one chick will survive. And the thing is, you'll see with this nest, they had 3. And the male's got to do a lot of fishing to get a brood of 3 chicks from hatched to fledging. This is where the long vigil begins now. She's got 35 days where she's got to sit on eggs. And, she sits through, if you think of, the end of April to early May, we're going to go from, days like today where it's kind of cold, or we'll get cold, rainy days, or miserable days, and we'll get hot days, and she just sits out there on those eggs. She'll get up, she'll roll them over, she'll move around, but she'll settle back down. Some of them share, excuse me, some of them will share duty. The nests I've seen, the females do most of the incubating, but the males will help out depending on their personalities, I guess, basically. This is a nest that was built, this is a platform that I built for a lady in Bristol. I thought Sean might be here today. They own they call it Fishhawk Farm, Fishhawk is an osprey. And back in the day, they had a wagon wheel on a pole in the barnyard. And this was done, farmers did this. The first osprey platforms weren't invented by us. They were actually, Martha and Don Betts, they gave me a journal from a guy who was indentured on Prudence Island in, I think, 1755. And he talks about an osprey platform on the farm on a pole, on a wagon wheel on a pole. So putting osprey poles up goes back at least that far. And I built this one for Sean because they had one and she wanted to put one back up. because her elderly mother, like, used to look out the window and wanted to see the ospreys back. So we put it up, and the first year nobody took it, which is not unusual. The second year she got a pair, and they took the platform, and she was texting me, and she said, they mated, and then she said they're sitting on eggs. And then she sent me a text. She said, Butch, they're gone. They're both off fishing somewhere. And then they come back to the nest, and they stand around in the nest, and they look in the nest like, what the hell is that? And then they're off fishing again. So I said, young osprey are like teenagers. You're basically they're young parents. And for whatever reason, sometimes they mate, but they don't fertilize the eggs. And in this instance, she laid her eggs, but she decided after a couple of weeks, I'm done with this. I'm not doing 5 weeks. I'm going. So the two of them spent the rest of the summer fishing. So Sean called me up and said, I don't know what's going on up there. So I said, I'll come over. And I was thinking I'll bring a ladder over and climb up and look in the nest. But then it dawned on me, I had gotten a drone. So I flew the drone up over the nest. And this is what was there. 2 eggs. You can see them, the 2 brown and white things. And she laid eggs, and they just quit. And, sometimes that happens, but they've been, ever since then, they've raised a brood every year. So once they matured and they got it right, they just started to nest, and now they're part of the osprey population that's producing new osprey every year. This is some of the stuff they put in their nest. I stalked this picture because I got a text from a friend who said, hey, Butch, is it the osprey, they got a flag in their nest. So I went down there, and the flag was hopelessly tangled in the nest. This nest is actually on the parade route in Bristol. So it was even more patriotic. At any rate, they got a bunch of plastic bags in there too. You can see them all sticking out of there. But the flag was, and this was right at the beginning of COVID, and the flag was like hopelessly tangled in there. We had a big windstorm a couple of days later, and I said to Cindy, I'm going to go back. I said, it probably blew the flag out, but I'm going to take a chance. I went back, and the flag had magically dropped. It was hanging by a thread, but it was unfurled to the wind, and I got a bunch of pictures like this. I went back again a couple of days later, and it had fallen out. But these guys are right near the North Burial Ground at Bristol. So what the male did was he just pilfered a flag out of the cemetery and brought it home. These guys have built their own privacy hedge. This nest started a year before. They brought something up there that still had roots, obviously. And a nest gets like a compost heap. So whatever they brought up took root. And then it started to grow. And throughout the summer, it got taller and taller. And it got to this stage. I was over there looking at it recently, and I think that pot has fallen down. I'm not sure if it's going to grow again. But if you see any of the big osprey nests like this, one thing you'll notice is house sparrows going in and out, because the house sparrows live in the bottom of the nest under the osprey. And they cohabitate, and the ospreys are no threat to the house sparrows. And, the house sparrows are no threat to the ospreys, so they just coexist in the same nest. One of the things I failed to mention about the farmers putting osprey poles in their fields, the reason they did that was because the ospreys are territorial. Farmers had chickens. Cooper's hawks attack the farmers' chickens and kill the chickens. Ospreys drive off the Cooper's hawks. So it was a relationship that worked for both. The ospreys got a nesting site, and the farmers got their crops protected, or the chickens protected. Here we have an open house. What you're looking at is mylar balloons. This pair, this was on the Palmer River, and Cindy and I were in kayaks going up the Palmer River, and I was looking at this nest, and I could see the bird in it, but I said, what the hell is in there? I said, it's not another bird. And she had binoculars, and I had the camera, but neither one we couldn't get the kayaks to sit still enough to see what it was until we got closer to the nest. They had picked up a whole set of Mylar, partially inflated Mylar balloons. And for some of the photographers here, Liz and Russ, the money shot is them flying across the river dragging a whole series of Mylar balloons over to the nest. The only problem with those is it's also, they're on that ribbon that they tie on these balloons, which is almost impossible to break. And that becomes a danger to the chicks and the adults, because they both can get entangled in it, and hopelessly entangled in it sometimes. And, you know, it can cause death. Another nest had a fishing rod sticking prominently out of the side of it. And again, for you guys, the money shot of an osprey flying in with a fishing rod would be... And there's a host of other things. I found gloves. I got a couple of things over there. One's a child's sand toy. I found a mechanical fish 2 years ago that they had actually taken up in a nest and tried to eat. It's over there. You can see the score marks on it where they tried to eat it. The DEM took a nest at one time, and they took a nest down and they put it in on a topple, and they brought it into a classroom in Jamestown, and they had the kids dissect the nest, just so they could see what's in the nest, see what the ospreys used to build it. And then they questioned the kids. And they said to one little girl raised her hand, and they called on her, and they said, you know, so what do you think? And she said, we throw a lot of stuff away. Meaning the ospreys had a lot of junk that they picked up around in their nest. This is where, while she incubates the eggs, he does the fishing. And they're pretty prolific and pretty accomplished fishermen. You know, their success rate is better than 50%. And to watch them fish, it's a real treat. I know Russ and Liz here have seen it many times. And for a lot of us who either photograph or watch these birds, to watch them go in and come out with a fish, it's pretty special. They only have about a 3-foot depth of water that they can work in. That's why shallow ponds or the Palmer River or 100-acre Cove are the best habitats for them, because the fish, first of all, those areas are not deep, so the fish is usually somewhere near the surface. An osprey in a full dive into a deeper body of water can hit 70 miles an hour. So can you imagine hitting the water at 70 miles an hour? And they stick their talons out in front of their head, and then they just lock onto a fish and go after it. This next shot is a unique perspective. This is shot from above, and this is an osprey hitting the water. You can see his wings spread out. His head and main body are completely underwater. You can see his head coming up in the middle between his wings, and his momentum is still carrying him forward. In the next shot, his head's out of the water now, but you can still see the wake. He's pushing water up in front of him, and it's water. The water's still turbulent behind him. This is him exiting, and he pulled out a herring. This is when the herring are running, which is one of their primary food sources. It's not a coincidence that the osprey arrive from their migration at the same time the herring are running. And the herring feed not only the osprey, eagles and any number of herons and raccoons, anything. They're a food source for a lot of arriving migrants. And this is him pulling up out of the area where he fished. This is what they do. He'll take a fish and take it to a perch. And if you've watched this, it's not pretty to watch. You don't want to be a fish, because the fish is alive when he starts eating it. He eats the head, and he brings the rest to the female. He'll feed her when she's sitting on the eggs, and then he'll either help her feed the young, or most of them drop the fish off and they're gone. It's like, okay, here's the groceries, I'm leaving, you feed the kids. But some of them will stay and help her feed the kids. And they, the fish will struggle for a while and then hopefully pass away before too long. But you wouldn't want to be a herring. This is, again, a unique perspective. This is an osprey from behind. You can see her talons are stretched out in front of her, and she's locked onto her fish. So she's in the middle of a dive. This is the moment, I blew this up, and her talons are just touching the water. She's just about to go in. And the rest of it's like a controlled crash. I mean, if you look at this thing, you think this bird had just crashed. But if you look in the right-hand bottom where her leg is, you can see like a silvery gold. That's the herring that she's got. She was successful. Now she's in the water and she's got to get out. And this is pretty amazing with these birds. You got to, this is a bird that weighs 4 pounds, and sometimes they'll latch onto a fish that weighs 1 pound. So now, think of it when you were a kid and you were swimming and you had to get up on the dock or into a boat. It's not that easy, just to get your own weight out of the water. Now somebody ties a 30-pound weight on your legs, and you've got to get up out of the water and onto the boat. And these guys have they've got to get up into the air, and the only thing they got are the wings. And it's to watch that first couple of initial flaps when they first pull themselves out of the water, the power is pretty amazing when you see it. Here she is still in the middle of, she's still, you can see the little bit of a wake in her, behind her, that's momentum still carrying her forward. She had to turn because she couldn't get out the way she was facing. So this presented the perfect opportunity. You can see the herring under her. She's got her in her right talon, and she's getting ready to exit the water. Osprey, unlike eagle, if you watch a bald eagle carry anything, I mean, they carry a fish or a rodent or whatever by they carry it sideways, backwards, upside down. It doesn't matter because they're such powerful flyers. They weigh 12 pounds as opposed to the 4 that the osprey weigh. So the osprey, you'll see every osprey do this. If you look at the fish, it's facing forward. They turn it so it's aerodynamic to decrease the drag. So when they fly, the fish is not creating drag so they can fly. It helps, it's just an efficient way for them to do it. And they're the only ones that do that. Everybody else is kind of haphazardly carries stuff. This is where, when they're in the middle of the incubation process, he'll catch fish and then he'll eat the head again, and he'll bring it to her, and he'll feed her, or he'll drop it off to her, and she'll feed herself. This is, again, where it gets comical. This is a young pair, and they're bonding. The female's on the right and the male's on the left. You can tell the female, if you look at her chest, they usually have that speckled necklace around their chest. The male is white. His chest is white. You can also see in this picture the difference in size. All of the raptors, the females are bigger than the males. They're larger. And you can see it, it's pretty evident here. These guys are obviously trying to build their first nest. This is a cross arm on the power lines, which is about as wide as maybe a 2x4 or a little wider. You can see that one stick balancing on the right, and he's standing on a stick. He's brought another one back. They did this for I don't know how long, where they nothing could stay up there. It's like trying to balance take a 2x4 and put it on sawhorses in your backyard and then try to put sticks on it. Nothing's going to stay there. And for the longest time, they would bring sticks in, put them on the crossbar, go. Sometimes they would leave and they weren't even gone before the stick fell off. They never successfully built a nest there. I don't know if they built somewhere else, but they weren't ever successful building in that spot, but I'm sure they were successful building somewhere else. But this is all part of the process when they first come back. When they're young, they don't get a lot of things right, but it's more the bonding between the two over a nesting site is more important than them actually getting the nest built. Now we're into June. This is when the eggs hatch. These eggs probably hatched around June. I'm trying to sharpen this a little bit. They probably hatched around June 1st. But this is the first time these guys were big enough to see, and there's 3 heads in the nest. So all 3 eggs she laid 3 eggs, and all 3 eggs hatched. This is now June 13th, and you can see 2 heads. And they don't look like ospreys yet. At this stage, they resemble their ancestors, the dinosaurs, more than they do birds. Again, they're not feathered yet. Their feathers are starting to grow in, but they still have some of their fuzz. You can see the little white fuzz on the back of 2 of them there. But their heads are starting to get the markings of an osprey by now. When you think about their process, they hatch the beginning of June. By late July, they have to be flying and they have to learn how to fish because they're going to leave by the beginning of August, or the chicks will sometimes go into September. But they really only have a 3-month period where they can, where all this happens. This has to all be accomplished in 3 years, from them hatching from the eggs to actually becoming functional osprey. This is, again, they change daily, they get bigger. If you go consistently, you can see the changes almost on a daily basis. If you miss like several days, you can really see the changes because they grow so fast, and they have to grow fast, and the change is evident, even in a day or 2. Here you can look at the little one. You can see the little one in front of the mother. She is starting to see the white. The white is starting. That means their feathers are starting to come in. And on his back, you can see more of feather than down. Now they resent. This is pretty much the point where they resemble their parents. We're now the 2nd of July, so they're about a month old now. And if you see the chicks, their eyes are orange, and the parents' eyes are yellow. And the chicks' feathers are tipped in white, the brown feathers, where the adults are all brown. And that's 2 of the ways you can tell it. When they're out of the nest and flying around individually, that's one of the ways you can tell the chicks. They won't lose the white. The orange eyes start to go away by the fall, but the white, they will lose that gradually over the next year or so before they come back. And ospreys don't come back. When they migrate, they don't come back right away. They spend the whole year down in wherever they go. Most of them go to South America. They'll spend the whole season there so they'll be almost 3 when they come back. This was pretty unique. All 3 chicks are in the nest. If you look at the nest, they're all in there. Something happened, and the mother, she let out an alarm call, and I was watching this. All 3 just disappeared instantly. They just flattened themselves out in the nest, and you can't see them. And that nest is not that deep. But there's a couple of nests on a Palmer River that are even shallower than that, and they disappear in those too. We're now the 12th of July, and you can see that they are now resembling their parents. They've got their flight feathers, and they're almost the same size as their parents. Now, flight school, I call this flight school. It begins earlier, but they start flapping. Even when they're little in the nest, they start flapping. An Osprey platform, when I first built my first one, I went and looked at dimensions. I got plans online, I looked at a lot of stuff, and they recommended building a 40 by 40 inch platform. And I said to myself, geez, that's awful small. But I did it according to the specifications, and I learned why after working on these things for a while. The larger you build the platform, the larger they're going to build a nest. If you built a 10-foot by 10-foot platform, they'd build a 10-foot by 10-foot nest. And that becomes a liability if you're putting up these platforms on poles, short poles or small poles in a marsh, because the weight of a 10 by 10 foot nest as opposed to this would probably be 10 times as heavy. So to keep the weight down, and they're able to function amazingly in this environment, but you're looking at, if all 5 birds in the nest at the same time, they're all this size, in a 40-inch by 40-inch nest. And these guys start practicing flying. I watched one of the chicks get ready to practice one day, and he got up on the side of the nest, and he threw his wings open and knocked his mother out of the nest. But they start flapping, and then they'll start lifting off the nest. And they'll, first of all, it'll only be an inch or two, and then pretty soon you'll see them, they'll go up 6, 7, 8 feet straight up, and they'll hover, which is a trait that they need to fish, because ospreys, a lot of times if you watch them, they'll spot a fish, and they're able to hover in one spot in order to zero in on the fish instead of flying around and having to come back in at the fish. They'll hover over it. So this hovering technique is developed in this stage also. This was the alpha chick. He made his first flight, and he landed. He tried to land on this pole. It's got a cap on it. You can see it. It's like just a smooth cap. Well, he hit that, and he went skidding right off the top of it. So he caught himself, flew around, came back in, and he made it. He landed on the second attempt. Now there's only 2 chicks left in the nest. You can see these 2. And again, all 3 of these chicks were really healthy. So this male throughout this breeding season did a really great job of providing food for this, because he's feeding 5 basically, himself, the female, and the 3 chicks, and all 3 chicks grew pretty evenly. I waited for this moment, and I kept going because I wanted to catch the runt fledging. And I went in the morning, and she was just sitting in the nest. Nothing was going on. I went home to have lunch. I came back, and again, there was nothing going on. And then all of a sudden, the male came in with a fish. So the runt is on her left. The mother is feeding her. She started feeding her. And this is a little bathroom humor, but we need this. This is several reasons for this. One, this is how they keep their nest clean. Whenever they have to go, they back up to the edge of the nest, and birds, I guess you could call it projectile pooping, because that's the way they do it. But and it's also an indicator for Russ and Liz know what I'm talking about, and some of you people, if you're birders, know this too. A bird, before it flies, will probably 99% of the time take a dump. It's basically economics. It's lightening the load before you take to the air. But it's also, if you're watching them, it's an indicator that they're going to fly. So she did this. So now I'm anticipating her taking her first flight. And this is where she did it. She went to the edge of the nest. There was about a 15-mile-an-hour wind blowing from the southwest, which is out to the left in the picture. She spread her wings, and she just pushed off with her feet and did a big loop around the nest, and then came back in and landed. And I got to witness her first flight. And the young ones they'll come back to the nest, they'll return to the nest to be fed. Parents will feed them, but they also teach them to fish, but they don't, they teach them by example. And Cindy and I witnessed this on the Palmer River one day. We went up the river in probably around this time, or earlier, it was earlier in August, probably first or second week of August. And it was a really nice day. The river was flat calm. There was, but there had to be over 20 ospreys in the air at one time, all circling, all calling. The kids were up there, the adults were up there. we realized that this was flight and fishing school. And so we just pull the kayaks in onto, there's a little sandy spot behind Swansea Country Club. We just pull the kayaks in and sat on the beach and watched this whole thing go on. And you could watch the parents, they would call, they're a noisy bird anyway. For any of you who spend any time with them, they are very vocal. And so there was all this calling going on, and you watch the adults, they would flap and then they'd dip down and they'd go back up again. And basically it was just, and if there was a fish, all of a sudden you hear a splash and one of them would go in. And they'll continue to feed the kids, but they'll withhold food sometimes, and so hoping, the kids eventually get the idea that they're supposed to do this, and they'll start doing fishing on their own. This was a story, some of you followed this story on Facebook. Lizzie was a fledgling that Rob Beauregard is probably, there's several, I got some books over there if any of you want to look for references. They're great, they're all good books to read. One of them was written by Rob Beauregard. It's a kid's book, but it's great. He's probably he is one of the most renowned osprey researchers in the world. He put an osprey tracker on Lizzie. He named her Lizzie up in New Hampshire. He put a tracker on her, and she started her migration south. And I had been playing in the golf tournament. I got home one evening, and I had a message. I checked my email, and I had a message from Audubon, John Schoons, who runs the Osprey monitoring program. He said he had heard from Rob Beauregard. They had put an osprey tracker on Lizzie, and she had left New Hampshire, but she stopped on the Palmer River. She stalled, basically, on the Palmer River, and she's been sitting like in one spot for a day. He said that's normally a death spiral. When an osprey with a tracker stops, that usually means that they died somewhere. But because she was in the vicinity of a known nest, that our Audubon had mapped all the nests in Rhode Island, they thought she might be in a nest, and they asked me if I would go look, and I did. And I drove over, and I was able to see it from Mike and Sandy's property where the other nest was. This nest was up on the power lines. So I looked up, and I didn't even need binoculars. I could see the sun glinting off her transmitter. So I went back home, and I sent Rob an email, and I said, she's here, and she looks fine. So he thanked me. But now, for me, this started a whole new adventure, because for the first time, I had an osprey that I knew. I could tell her, because they all look the same, and unless there's some kind of mark. I had one on the Palmer River that had a feather missing at its elbow. I nicknamed him Notch. It's actually their wrist, but it's like our elbow. He had a feather missing, so I named him Notch, and he was the only bird I could tell in flight, because I would see that it never regenerated. Something happened to the follicle, but I knew Notch, and that was the only osprey I could tell. Everybody else, other than male and female, looked the same. Lizzie, on the other hand, had a tracker, so I knew where she was all the time. The other thing was Rob has a website called Osprey Tracks, and for any of you who are interested, look it up, TRAX. He was following her, so I figured when she leaves here, I'm going to be able to follow this bird all the way to South America. I'm going to be able to watch where she is in South America, and when she comes back when she makes her first migration back, I'll be able to follow her back and know where she is. So I started going every day. I went the next morning, and she was sitting in the nest. The nest that she was sitting in had fledged 2 chicks, but she was the only one in there. The other chicks I didn't see the other chicks around. And she was calling to be fed. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, her parents are in New Hampshire. Who's she calling? Well, one of the adults that owned that nest was sitting on a power pole next to me with a fish, and Lizzie flew from the nest to a power pole adjacent to the adult and started calling to the adult to be fed. And I said, how's this going to go? Lizzie flew back to the nest. The adult followed her into the nest, dropped the fish off with her, and left. And I said, holy crap, this wasn't her mother, and this osprey doesn't even know this is not her chick, and fed her. Meanwhile, one of the other chicks who grew up in the nest came flying in, figuring he's going to get a meal, and Lizzie drove him out. Well, she took over the nest, and for 2 weeks, I was going at least twice or 3 times a day to check on her. I finally got a message from Rob one day saying, and I had gone that day, and Lizzie was there, but she got a fish, and she took off and headed south. So I thought she was just flying around, and I got an email from Rob saying, Lizzie started her migration, she's on her way, she's in Tiverton. So I went over to Mike's to check the nest, and there's Lizzie in the nest. So I sent Rob an email back. I said, she may have started, but she's back. A couple of days later, I got another email from Ian Mcleod up at the Science and Nature Center in New Hampshire. Ian worked with Rob. He was with Rob when they put the tracker on Lizzie, and he said, Butch, Lizzie's across the river from the nest, and he said she hasn't moved in over 12 hours. He said, can you go over there? Is there another nest over there or something? And I said, no, there's no nest over there. I said, but I'll go over and look. So I had my grandson Will with me, and we tried to walk out in the marsh, but any of you try to walk to a salt marsh, forget it, unless you want to sink into mud up to your waist. So I gave it up, and I went back home, and the next day I threw my kayak in, and I kayaked over there. And Ian had given me pretty specific. He sent me a blown up Google Earth image with an X where she was. So I beached the kayak. I walked maybe 15 feet, and I found her pretty much wings spread, dead in the eelgrass. And the day before, when I went to go look for her and she wasn't in the nest, there was another bird on the power lines that I photographed. And I didn't really pay much attention to the photograph till this happened, and I went back and looked at the photograph, and the photograph was of a peregrine falcon. And I think what happened to Lizzie was the falcon hit her in mid-river. And the kill from a peregrine comes from the impact. They dive at up to 150 miles an hour, and when you hit a bird, it's blunt force trauma. And I think Lizzie just glided into the eelgrass and got stuck there. And I looked up the tides, and it was high tide, so there was no way that the peregrine, after it killed her, could get to her because she was in the water, but the eelgrass held her there. So I pulled her out of the eelgrass. Rob asked me if I could get the transmitter, and so they put the transmitter on with like a little backpack with Teflon ribbon. So I cut it off, and this is the transmitter next to my key fob for the car, so you can get an indication of how big they are. And it uploads right to a satellite. So it uploads data, I think, every 12 hours to a satellite. So they have pretty much updated data as to where the bird is. When I sent it back, I had to insure it for $4,000. So, every bird they put these on, it's $4,000, and they don't get a lot of them back if something happens to the bird. Matter of fact, Ian told me a story of they lost a bird in Venezuela, and for a year, she died. A year later, they started getting data. So they contacted somebody down there and asked them if they could go and check. And they found the transmitter. Apparently, wherever she died, the transmitter, they're solar powered. So the transmitter was upside down. Some animal must have been rooting around, flipped it back over, and as soon as it flipped over, it charged. And it just uploaded like a year's worth of data, which was all right there where the transmitter was. This is a typical osprey migration. They make anywhere from a 2,500 to 5,000 mile one-way trip. This was Penelope. This is one of Rob's birds. They put a tracker on her on Martha's Vineyard. You can see it here. She flew from Martha's Vineyard to Maryland, spent 3 days in Maryland, and then went to North Carolina, flew to the Bahamas, spent 4 days working her way down the Bahamas, blew through the Dominican Republic in 29 hours. At night, she launched over the Caribbean, flying all night, and the next day to an island off Venezuela. A week later, she was in the rainforests of French Guiana, and she spent the next 18 months here. This is a pretty typical osprey migration, although some of the young birds will head, if you look at Massachusetts where she started, they will head directly south until they hit the Caribbean. So that's a several-day flight. And some of the things they found out with these Osprey transmitters, they had one bird, he flew from Massachusetts, I think all the way to Venezuela. And they plotted his track. Now these birds fly in all kind of weather. They fly through storms, they fly through headwinds, tailwinds, winds hitting them from either side. This guy's whole track was a straight line from Martha's Vineyard to either the islands of Venezuela. His track in all that traveling never varied more than 6 miles left or right of a dead straight line. This is how they theorized that ospreys and birds in general can read the Earth's magnetic field. They know they're heading south and they know they're heading north, and they can tell. And it kind of proves it because a lot of times, you couldn't see the moon, couldn't see the sun, couldn't see the stars. It could be raining. One of the ospreys in Rob's book, and this happens to the birds too. She ran smack into a hurricane, and that's what happens to a lot of them because they migrate during hurricane season. She flew into one of the hurricanes, but she kept heading south. The hurricane blew her west, and she finally blew far enough west of the hurricane to pick up the southerlies from the hurricane and started heading south again and wound up arriving in Venezuela. But some of the birds run into the wrong side of a hurricane and they don't survive it. So bird migrations are pretty unique, and it's also, we run marathons and think we're pretty cool, and then you get a bird like a hummingbird that they fly to the Gulf Coast and they bulk up from 2 to 4 ounces and fly to Gulf of Mexico. So there's no flies on them as far as being the better athlete or the better endurance athlete. That's pretty much my presentation. I think we're supposed to be an hour, and it's right on an hour. So I don't know if anybody has any. Does anybody have any questions? It would take,
New Hampshire, what's his last name?
It's not, actually, copy it. It's on the book. It's Bieregaard. It's Beauregard. So basically, it's easy to copy it out of the book.
Okay. It's not the traditional spelling.
No. I don't know. I don't know if he's Dutch or.
So they should have the eggs in the nest now then.
Huh?
Eggs should be in the nest right now then.
Definitely. Any female if she's sitting, she's got eggs. Yeah.
How long do they live?
I think they live. I think they live up to 12 or 13 years. Obviously, they live in a world that's pretty, dangerous. I mean, just in natural, their travels, number one. They're hunted in South America by the natives, so they face that. Some of the birds, one of the things that, there's a lot of fish farms now. That's become a thing, fish farm. Unfortunately, a fish farm for an osprey is like McDonald's takeout. Here they are, they have all these fish, they're not in deep pools, so they start stopping at fish ponds and start raiding fish ponds, and some of the owners will shoot them, especially in like Cuba and places like that where they're not as restrictive as far as where you can shoot and where you can't shoot.
So this first migration is entirely by instinct. Is
Yes.
there any tendency thereafter for the families to live together or
No.
in any sort of proximity?
No, yeah, actually there is. Ospreys, first of all, they migrate independently. It's not like geese that get in a flock and go south. They just individually leave. If you start watching like the Palmer River or places like that, and that, for me, it's always, this time of year, it's really kind of joyful because they come back. But when it comes to like August, and I'll go check like Sandy's Nest and they'll be there, And the next day, go check Sandy's, and they're gone. And, you know, it's kind of like your friends took off to Florida and never said goodbye. And what was the other?
So when they come back north, do they tend to?
They come back to the same area, not necessarily where they were, right where they were born. Like a bird born here would come back maybe to, you know, let's say it was born on the Palmer River, it might be on go to Lees River in Swansea, or the Barrington River, or, you know, they might go either further east or west. They come back to the general vicinity, but not to where not exactly where they were born, because they imprint on that, the area that they were born in. They recognized it. Actually, I watched a bird return from migration, and I knew that simply because of the behavior. He was flying up I caught him flying up the Palmer River, and he was on a beeline, which is not necessary. The way he was flying was following the shore. He was about 30, 40 feet up, and he was just on a straight line, kind of like he was following the magnetic field of the Earth. He went over the Johannes property. There's 3 platforms on Johannes. There's the south, middle, and north. He flew over the south, he flew over the middle, he flew over the north. He continued on until he reached the end of the marsh, which there were trees. And then he did a circle, and he came back, and he started circling the nest. And the circle got smaller and smaller. And finally, when he got to, like, almost down to nothing, he flew over the nest, flew back out to the end of the marsh, turned around, came back, flew in, flared up, and landed. And I said to I just watched the bird come back. He just arrived. And 2 weeks later, Mike Gerhardt was here. We were putting up a platform, when we put up the one between the 2 trees, remember that one, the Indian burial ground platform. I was up on a ladder, and the platform we had put in Jacobs Point a few years before was now active, and I was up, bird flew over my head, and I yelled down at Mike, and I said, Mike, you know, bird. Well, this bird, I watched him do exactly the same thing when he went to the Jacobs Point platform. He flew on a dead straight line, went over the platform, went out to the end, then did the whole circle thing, then flew back out, came back, and landed. So it had to be them verifying they were where they were, and once they were sure, they landed.
You have a feel for what the flight might be towards the traveler, and also when they're hunting, how far can they see the fish?
That's good. The visual acuity of an osprey or any raptor, an owl, eagle, they said that they can make out a license plate from a mile away. So basically, like, you know, listen, any of you guys, you can't sneak up on a bird. They're going to see you way before you see them. You know, very, very seldom. Sometimes you will surprise them, but most of the time, you know, they've seen you long before you've seen them. And they just hunt from. It's more. Not necessarily any particular, you know, some days you'll see them flying, they'll be way up, you know, a couple hundred feet, and other days they'll be, you know, 10 or 15 feet. It's just whatever, it's probably got to do with where the fish are, and there's visibility issues, you know, wind and rain and everything else impact that. So, anybody else?
How far from where they're fishing can their nests be?
They travel, you know, the ospreys around here fish. If they were nesting on the Palmer River, they would fish the Palmer, the Kiki, they'd probably go over to the Lees River and.
So if the platform were a mile inland, they might still take it.
What's that?
If a platform were a mile inland, they might take it?
They might, but they like to be near water. You know, you won't see a lot of nests that are not near some kind of a body of water, a pond, or you know, an inlet or somewhere like that. That's just they want to be near, but they'll travel. I mean, if you go, I mean, over 100-acre cove, you're gonna see probably the Palmer River birds there. You'll see the 100-acre cove birds over the pond. They just go where the fish are, basically.
So do they eat freshwater?
They eat both. Yeah, fish is fish. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter?
No, there's a perfect example is the Palmer River. There's Merriman's Pond at Swansea Country Club, which was freshwater, which is dammed off from the Palmer River, and they'll go back and forth between the two.
Do we know how long they'll go without food while they're migrating?
Yeah, they go, that's a good point. One thing about ospreys, they are found on every continent except Antarctica. So they're a worldwide bird. Ospreys fly in the European area. If they go from Europe, they'll fly the Sahara Desert, which takes them like 4 or 5 days. And that's in the air. I mean, when they fly from here to down into the islands or down to South America, that takes them, they travel about 20 miles an hour. So it takes them, 4 or 5 days to, and that's without food or water. So they're hungry when they get back here, and they're hungry when they arrive down there, basically, and thirsty. I don't want to take away from
All
you.
right. Thank you, Butch.
Thank you.